Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's get started and look into the first article. The first article says, are NRIs likely to get postal voting right soon? We have the Election Commission of India. It had recently approached the Law Ministry. Why? Because it was seeking the Law Ministry the permission to provide rights to the NRIs who are not in India but in some other country an opportunity to vote in general elections in India. In this particular backdrop, let us try and understand what is this postal voting rights all about. First important question, who is a NRI? The non-resident Indian is an Indian citizen who resides in India for less than 182 days during the course of the preceding financial year. So any person who is not in India but living in some other country but is the citizen of India and living for more than 182 days in another country, such a person is called as the NRI. Apart from this, let's say there is a person who has gone out of India or who stays outside India for the purpose of employment, or he has gone out as a business proposal or for a vacation, or he has gone out with any other intention to stay outside for a certain period of time. Such people are called as the NRIs. So what is the objective here? The objective of the election commission is to make sure that all these Indian citizens living in some other country have the opportunity to vote in the state elections as well as in the Lok Sabha elections. Why was this particular initiative taken by the election commission? That is because according to the election commission of India, most of the Indian diaspora are looking and are opting to vote for the Indian elections, but they are not able to come to India. Why? Because it is a costly affair. Let's say for example, if a person who is currently in United States of America has to come for a single day, he literally has to spend more than 1 lakh for up and down as well. As a result, it becomes a costly affair. So the Election Commission of India has requested the Law Ministry to basically make sure that it provides the permission for postal ballot. Then we have number of people who are also employed in different countries. Let's say USA, these people are also employed as well. They might not get permission from that organization or from the country to go during this particular period. So because they are employed in some other country, or they might have exams, or they are related to education as well, they might also have other engagements where they might not be able to come to India to personally vote in favor of a particular political party and a candidate who's contesting elections in India. As a result, the Election Commission of India has requested the Law Ministry to grant permission such that for all these kind of voters, we have a provision of what is called as postal voting. First, we have to understand how many NRIs are there when it comes to India. Let us look at some of the statistics. According to UN report of 2015, Indian diaspora population is the largest in the world at about 16 million people. Registration of NRI voters in comparison has been very low as well. A little over 1 lakh overseas Indians have registered as voters in India according to the Election Commission. In 2019 Lok Sabha elections, roughly about 25,000 of them flew to India to vote. In this particular backdrop, we have to understand when this particular process of providing or an initiation to provide the NRIs voting had taken place in India. We had number of proposals in the past as well, but it gained currency when the proposal was made by Rajya Sabha MP and industrialist Navin Jindal, and a proposal was also made by the Ministry of Overseas Affairs, and there were three writ petitions that were filed by the NRIs in Supreme Court in 2013 as well as 2014. Since there was a push from the overseas ministries back then, and we also had the push from the Rajya Sabha MP, and there was petitions that were filed in the Supreme Court of India, we had the origination of coming up with what is called as the postal voting. After this particular proposal, there was a 12-member committee which was set up after 2014 Lok Sabha elections to study whether this particular process has to be initiated. There were three options that this 12-member committee came up with. What are those? One is what is called as the voting by post. The second is what is called as voting at an Indian mission abroad. And third is called as the online voting. So what is this online voting? Let's say for example, a link will be sent to them. Candidates list will be provided in that particular list along with the political parties. Let's say through this particular online process, if I as a person living in United States of America vote for a political candidate or for a political party by an online process, that is what is called as the online voting. So a link will be generated and these people might be able to vote in that particular link. But there was a problem with online voting. What was the major problem? One is to do with secrecy. Why? Let's say for example, if there is a particular person who's voted for a political candidate or for a political party, if this is brought into a public forum, his right of secrecy is ultimately violated. We also know for the fact that when we are voting in the elections, we need not have to reveal for the person whom we have voted. But in the online platform, there might be a provision where the secrecy of that particular person voting for a political candidate might be revealed, and this violates the very principle of secrecy when it comes to the elections. Apart from this, there is also a possibility of hacking as well. In case people are able to hack and they are able to change the voting pattern, even that would be with interfering with the democratic process as well. Then we also have another option that was given by the 12 member committee. What was this option? This is about voting at Indian mission abroad. Let's say for example, we have the Indian embassy in United States of America, or let's say for example, we have consulates in number of parts in a particular country. Indian people who are present in that particular country might be asked to go to the embassy or close by to the embassy, or in fact they might asked to be go to the consulate offices as well. But there is a small problem here. When you look at the embassy or the consulate, the number of people who are working is comparatively less as well. As we all know, election is a huge process which will require large number of security personnel and people who are present in that particular scenario for the conduction of elections. But when it comes to the embassies and consulate, the major problem is there are less number of people who are present in that part, and as a result, this particular proposal was also immediately ruled out as well. The third option is what is called as voting by post. So this was the option which was taken up by the election commission, which it is also putting forward right now along with what is called as the proxy voting. Proxy voting was given by the earlier recommendation, but in the present scenario we have the election commission which is only putting forward what is called as the postal ballot. What is the concept of proxy voting? Let's say for example, I am in United States of America. I appoint one of the persons from my family to vote for a person whom I like. So in this particular case, we have one person nominating another person who is acting as a proxy to vote for me in my constituency. That is called as proxy voting. But the election commission in the present scenario is not looking at proxy voting, but it is looking at voting by post. In this particular backdrop, we have to understand what is this whole process of postal ballot and how it is implemented. Prior to 2010, an Indian citizen who is an eligible voter and was residing abroad for more than 6 months owing to employment, education or otherwise would not have been able to vote in the elections. This is because their names was completely deleted from the electoral roll. That is because they were staying outside the country for more than 6 months at a stretch. They did not have any provision whatsoever to come back to India and vote as well. But after that, there was a change that was made with respect to the Representation of the People Amendment Act of 2010. According to it, eligible NRIs. Who are the eligible NRIs? They should be above 18 years of age, and these are the people who should have their names in the electoral list. Such people could have come back to India and voted in person as well. Before 2010, they were not supposed to come to India and they could not have voted. But after 2010, since we had a major amendment with respect to the Representation of the People Act, there was a provision where that person who is residing in another country can physically come to India, vote for a political candidate and a political party. Now the question is, who is he going to vote? In which constituency is he going to vote? We have something called as the passport. On the passport, there is the address. So this person who's given the relevant address on the passport, so he would be voting on that particular constituency where his address is provided. Let's say for example, if it is in Delhi, he would be voting in Delhi. If the passport has a provision where his address is from Bengaluru, he would be voting in Bengaluru. So likewise, whichever constituency's address he is given, he would be voting as per the passport address. That is how it was working. So after 2010, the major provision that was introduced is this person could fly from any country, come back to India, vote in person with that particular passport and its address that was present on the passport. And now is the proposal for the introduction of the postal ballot system. As we initially discussed, every person had to come over physically. This was a costly affair. They had to let go their opportunities in education and employment. They also had to seek the information and permission from that particular employer. As a result, it was a costly affair. In order to overcome the issue, what we have is a proposal for the introduction of the postal ballot system. How does this process basically work? According to the Election Commission proposal, any NRI who is interested in voting through a postal ballot in any of the election will have to inform the returning officer not later than 5 days after the notification of the election is released by the Election Commission of India. So once he makes that particular request, the returning officer will immediately dispatch what is called as the ballot paper electronically. So once he makes a request to the returning officer will make sure that every aspect of this particular notification is immediately checked, and after this is done, he immediately sends a ballot paper electronically, that is via the email. So what will this person do? This person will immediately download this particular copy and he has to provide his personal attestation. He also has to provide that he is voting to this particular candidate as well as to a political party, and ultimately this also has to be attested by the embassy present in that particular country or the consulate office. So only after it is got the personal attestation and also by the officer appointed by the diplomatic or the consular representative of India in that particular country, that is when this particular initiative will be accepted in India. So is it in use currently? Yes. This particular process of what is called as the postal ballot is currently available. For whom? It is available for the service voters. Who are the service voters? Let's say for example, they are the armed forces who are working for India. Those people who come under the Army Act of 1950, or let's say for example, Government of India's officials who are posted outside India. For all such people, we already have what is called as the postal ballot, which is initiated by the Government of India, and they would be able to cast their vote as well. So going forward, a similar proposal is also given for the NRI. So it is up for the Law Ministry right now to accept it or reject it. What we have to understand in this particular process is that this does not require the parliamentary nod. All that the government has to do is to amend the conduct of the election rules of the 1961. But since we are living in a parliamentary democracy, the government will also have to take the consensus of the major political parties in India and ultimately bring about an end or a resolution to this particular matter. So what is the significance of this particular proposal? If this is accepted by the Law Ministry and if it is implemented, it can change the political dynamics in India. As of now, we have only people from India who would be voting, but in the near future, NRIs would also be voting, and this could also result in change of fortunes for the political parties. In fact, when you look at the previous instances of 2019, there was a greater turnout among the service voters when it comes to the 2019 Lok Sabha elections. If this is implemented with large number of Indian diaspora who are present in United States of America, UK, elsewhere and in the Gulf countries, they can change the political fortunes in India, and ultimately the right to vote, which is a constitutional mandate given to every single person, will be implemented with this particular execution. Further, we have one of the institutes called as the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Alliance, which happens to be an intergovernmental organization which usually supports the democratic process in institutions. This has also approved this very fact that postal ballot will increase the number of people who would have the right to vote when it comes to the democratic process. So these have been the significant aspects when it comes to the postal ballot. But the major issue right now is with respect to the challenges. So what are these challenges? Let's say for example, when it comes to the United States of America, it's a huge country. So we have the embassies which are situated in a country. We might also have the consular offices as well. How are we going to collect all this is a major problem, and that will cost a huge logistic cost as well. And at the same time, there are certain countries, let's say for example in Gulf countries, let's take for example Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates. These countries do not have what is called as democracy. So how are we going to conduct democratic principles, democratic actions in such countries which believes in monarchy or what is called as hereditary pattern of governance? So in this particular backdrop, the major challenges would include the logistics when it comes to the democratic countries of United States of America or in UK, or when we look at the Gulf countries where there are no ideas of democratic principles, how are we going to conduct the democratic elections in these countries? These are some of the challenges when it comes to the execution of the postal ballot system. So going forward, in case this particular proposal is accepted by the law ministry, there has to be a proper authentication process, a designated place where this particular activity is conducted. We also require the personnel to authenticate this information, and ultimately rules will have to be framed on the basis of eligibility, time spent away from the country, and when all these rules are clearly spelled, this process of postal ballot will become a successful one. It is this that we have to understand with reference to this article. Now let's look into the next article. This article says ethical challenges of vaccinating people with comorbidities. We have the Union Health Ministry which had recently issued guidelines for the COVID-19 vaccination. What were these guidelines all about? This was about the high risk groups. What are these high risk groups? Let's say for example, there are people who are suffering from comorbidities, or let's say for example, there are people who are suffering from other ailments as well. In all these cases, how are we going to make sure that we are providing vaccination as per the priority? So in this particular backdrop, the health ministry has given certain guidelines. What are these guidelines? It first goes on to say that vaccination will have to be provided for the healthcare workers, frontline workers, persons over 50 years of age, and persons younger than 50 years with comorbidity. So this is the criteria given by the health ministry. Now the question is, what is the whole point of comorbidity? Let's say for example, when you have a person who is already suffering from some ailments, let's say he is suffering from hypertension, diabetes, liver disease, heart disease, asthma, or kidney failure, or heart issues, or any of the other issues where his body is already under a lot of stress. Such person who's already suffering from an existing ailment, such person is suffering from what is called as comorbidity. So in case vaccination has to be provided, it has to be based on the question of priority. This is where we require what is called as the database and statistics. Whom are we going to provide the vaccination? We already know that we would be able to provide vaccination to the healthcare workers. Why? Because we visit the hospital or we take up the database from the relevant hospitals in the state as well as in the private domain. We would be able to provide vaccination. We would be also able to provide vaccination to the frontline workers as well. Who are these frontline workers? Let's say for example, the accredited social health activists, the ASHA workers, the Anganawadi workers, or the auxiliary nurse midwives as well. To all these people, we would again be able to provide the vaccination as well. But the problem appears for all those persons who are above 50 years of age with comorbidity and young people who are less than 50 years of age with comorbidity. For administering vaccination to these people, what we require is the statistics. This is where we have a crunch when it comes to statistics, says the article. So the major problem is at the national level, we do not have a national database where all the statistics are provided where this person has a comorbidity or not is not present at the national level. But we have an advantage when it comes to the state government. What are those? One of the important programs run by the state government is what is called as the National Program for the Prevention and Control of Cancer, Diabetes, Cardiovascular Disease and Stroke. This was one of the programs which was asked by the central government to the state governments to implement this particular program. So what is this program all about? We have something called as the communicable diseases. What are these communicable diseases? Let's say for example waterborne or vector-borne disease or TB or HIV. This can be transmitted from one person to another, but there are certain non-communicable diseases. Let's say for example, if we are speaking about heart issues, these are not communicable, which means these cannot be transmitted from one person to another person. When you look into the statistics, what had also resulted was the number of people who were dying because of the non-communicable diseases were increasing. As a result, what we required was the statistics in order to cut down on the deaths because of the non-communicable disease. So the central government requested the state governments to come up with this particular program of National Program for the Prevention and Control of Cancer, Diabetes, Cardiovascular Disease and Stroke. So what was the major objective? The major objective was health promotion through behavioral change, screening and early detection of who were these people who are suffering from non-communicable disease, timely, affordable and accurate diagnosis, and when we diagnose, we also take their names, put it onto a database as well. Access to the affordable treatment and rehabilitation of all these people who were suffering from non-communicable disease. So currently this article goes on to say, if we have to provide vaccination for the people who are suffering from comorbidities, we can take up the statistics from this particular database. So it is asking the government that if you are looking at providing vaccination to the people who are suffering from comorbidities, since we do not have a national statistics, we can look at these statistics which is already present at the state level. There is another program as well, and that particular program is the Ayushman Bharat initiative. If we have collected statistics for this particular scheme, once again the same can be used for vaccination to be provided to the people who are suffering from non-communicable diseases. But again, all the database and the statistics, both with respect to Ayushman Bharat or with respect to the National Program for the Non-Communicable Disease data statistics, is still not comprehensive. There is a lacuna area where number of state governments have either not implemented, or even if they are implemented, they have not kept up the statistics on a comprehensive basis. That is the first ethical dilemma, says this particular article. Ideally, people who have comorbidities should be given the vaccination first to the senior citizens and then to the younger population who are suffering from comorbidities. But since we do not have the data and statistics, that is the major ethical dilemma, is the first point of introspection. The second point of introspection is about comorbidities and multiple comorbidities. Let's say for example, when it comes to the comorbidities, let's say there is a person who is suffering from diabetes, there is another person who is suffering from heart issue, there is another person who is suffering from kidney ailments. So if vaccination has to be provided, what should be the priority? Should we give the vaccination first to the heart patient, or should we give it to the kidney ailment patient, or should it be given to a person who is suffering from diabetes? So what is the hierarchy? What is the priority? This is again not given. This is another dilemma. Let's say for example, there is multiple comorbidities. Let's say if there is a particular person who is suffering from diabetes and he also has an heart issue, or let's say there is a person who is suffering from diabetes and he also has a kidney issue. So he has number of ailments within his body. So what is the priority that has to be followed? Again, we have no answers to such question. In fact, whatever has to be done, it has to be done on the basis of priority, says this article. Let's say if there is an elderly person with multiple morbidity, or there is an elderly person with single morbidity, such should be the priority, says the article. Followed by this, we have the young with the multimorbidity, and the young with morbidity seems to be a sensible order of priority, says this particular article. So the second ethical dilemma is about priorities, is about whom should we administer the vaccination if they are suffering from multiple comorbidities. Now, the third ethical dilemma is with respect to the hierarchy which is present in the society. This breaks down into three important compartments. One is the rich person, the second is the middle class Indian, and the third is the poor Indian. What is the major problem here? Let's say, for example, when there is a rich person, or let's say, for example, there is an educated person. Most of these people in India will have all the statistics and the documentation when it comes to their health crisis. So, what do? They go to the private hospitals and they are able to fend for themselves as well. So when they go to the private hospitals, they will have all the documents that which is present with reference to their health issues. So in case they are suffering from some of the issues, these documents can be accessed and vaccination can be given to them. Why? Because they are educated, they are also rich, and the private hospitals also have a database as well. So they would have all the documentational evidence, all the documents that is required with respect to their past history of their comorbidities. Now, let's say, for example, with respect to the middle class Indians, these people might not even know that they have certain ailments. In such a scenario, because they do not have the statistics, because they do not have the documents about the comorbidities, can we say that when vaccination is provided, the middle class Indians might miss out on the vaccination? Now, let's take the poor sections as well, especially when it comes to the rural sector. These people, once again, do not have relevant information about their disease status. They are unaware about their comorbidities as well. They might not even know that they have diabetes or any other ailments as well. In such a scenario, it is the rich who will get the vaccine at the cost of middle class Indian or the rural poor, says this article. So this happens to be the third dilemma as discussed under this article of ethical challenges of administering vaccination. The last ethical dilemma, that which is being discussed under this article, is about the gender bias. This article currently goes on to speak about male and the female comparison. As of now, when you look into the statistics, the number of male people who have died during this particular COVID-19 is comparatively more than the female population. There it is also being said that males have been found to be at a greater risk of COVID-19 than the females. So the question that is being asked by the author is whether this will exacerbate the gender-based inequality. It is some evidence and some statistics which is revealing it, but do we have a comprehensive number? We do not have it. As a result, the article is projecting that males might get more vaccination compared to the females, exacerbating the gender inequality. These are the various ethical dimensions that when it comes to vaccination and comorbidities. So what should be done going forward? When we look into this article, the article goes on to say, as of now, we do not have a national database. Since database is required for giving the vaccination, going forward, the databases at the national level will also have to be strengthened, says the first important argument. The second one, states should also allow people with comorbidities to self-report as well. As we initially discussed, we have the poor section, we also have the middle class, we do not have the documentational evidences of their past health issues. So in case people go on to discover that they have certain ailments which happens to be comorbidity, such documentational evidence will have to be taken by the state governments and have to be updated as well, and these people will also have to be provided the vaccination. The third is people should also be tested for the blood glucose levels and the blood pressure, and new diagnosis and vaccination will also have to be provided to such people, is what we have to understand with reference to this article. Now let's look into the next article. This article says a tomorrow like no other. Kindly remember, this is not from the regular Hindu newspaper, but this is on the Sunday magazine of the Hindu. This article here is speaking about the work from home, the prospects of work from home, the concerns associated with work from home, and because people are working from home, what are the other sectors which will be impacted because of work from home. Whenever there is an economic shock, it usually leaves behind a legacy, and now we are also facing the worst of the economic shocks. So what is the COVID-19 taught us? That people can also work remotely, and one of the legacies of the COVID-19 is people working remotely and also from home. So what are the advantages of people working from home? When you look into into the statistics. 90% of India's 4.3 IT workforce moved to work from home when this particular COVID-19 hit the country. So what are the advantages? People who are working from home have flexible working hours, they are saving in the commute time, and they have a better work-life balance. This was present earlier, but this has also enhanced in the present scenario because of the COVID-19. Employers also feel that this was the right time to initiate the work from home. One, because they care for their employees, and at the same time, this also saved their rentals, costs on the electricity, facilities management, and also employee transportation as well. Let's say, for example, if you are working in an IT company, it requires huge amount of infrastructure. It also requires electricity 24 bar 7, so they are cutting down on the electricity expenses. Then they are cutting down on the transportation as well. Let's say there is an IT company which is support based. They have to provide transportation services, morning shift, afternoon shift, night shift, so on and so forth. With the cut down of the employees and all these employees working from home, these companies need not have to spend on the transport sector as well. Other important factor is, we all know for the fact that when we are working at home, the productivity increases. As much as the productivity is increasing, there is an other advantage as well. What are these advantages? That is, a particular person would also be able to virtually be present in multiple locations. Let me give you an example. This is what the article says. There was an eminent lawyer who has shared his experience, where he goes on to say that he has taken a case in the morning in the Supreme Court, in the afternoon in the Rajasthan High Court, and ultimately in the late afternoon he was also able to take up the case in the Karnataka High Court as well. Had it not been COVID-19, would this eminent lawyer be able to present in three different locations? No. So apart from the productivity, this particular COVID-19 has also made it flexible to be at multiple locations virtually. One such example is, as we have discussed currently. When you go back to the pre-COVID-19 era, the employer had a restriction. What was it? The employee had to physically come to the office premises to work in that particular location. Now, since it is work from home, he has a larger employee pool where he would be able to select, pick up the candidates for that particular role, since he is able to work from home as well. These are some of the advantages. This is not all. Yes, everything looks merry, but there are some worries as well. What are these worries? When it comes to the office setup, we had the furniture, we had the working conditions, but when it comes to the work from home, the furniture and the working conditions is not that good. This has resulted in health conditions as well. Many even have pointed that there is fall in productivity and performance. Why? Because when it comes to the office premises, you have the managers, you also have people who will have a constant vigilant eyes on the people working in the offices. But since they are working from home, it has also become working for home as well. And as a result, productivity in certain scenarios have also dropped, says this article. Absence of the physical interaction has also affected the ability to ideate as well. Let's say, for example, when it comes to the office premises, there are about 6 people, 10 people, or 20 people working in a group or as a team as well. So when they all come together, they discuss multiple viewpoints, they negotiate, they deliberate, discuss whether this particular idea is right or wrong. Right now, everything is happening on a virtual platform, and as a result, the output or the outcome is comparatively not good, says this article. And in fact, when you look at the 2020 McKinsey report, it goes on to say teams that work in same space find it easier to build the relationship as well as trust. This has also been confirmed by the Brookings Institution report, which has gone on to say that people prefer staying together, discussing things on a common platform and not on the virtual platform or the digital platform. So these are some of the disadvantages, but there is a third sector which is also impacted as well. What is the third sector? Because there is the IT company, or because there is an industry which is running in that particular area, there are other sectors which live on this particular sector. Let's say, for example, the office spaces. The office spaces will be provided by the real estate sector. Now, the real estate sector is in great danger. Let's say, for example, if there is an IT company, there will be rent houses as well. People from different localities like Uttar Pradesh, or let's say, for example, Hyderabad, they might move to Delhi as well. And as a result, around this IT sector, what you will have is the rent houses. Now, all these houses are vacant as well, and we will also face non-performing assets in the near future. Why? Because all these house owners would have taken loans for building up the houses. Since these houses are now vacant, they would not be able to pay back the loan, and as a result, what we will have is the non-performing assets. And finally, whenever there is an IT sector or a building close by, it will also open to the food industry, it will also open to the malls and the traditional stores as well. These people physically go there, eat there, purchase, and also bring a greater changes when it comes to other economic sectors. As of now, since they are at home, the food industry might not be going that well, and at the same time, since they are ordering all their products on the e-commerce, the traditional and malls are also suffering. So what is the way forward? Work from home is here to stay, but the companies will have to bring up what is called as the blended model or the hybrid model, where there are few days where companies call all its employees such that they would be able to discuss and come up with innovative ideas for the prospects of the employer as well as for the employee. And at the same time, when they also hit this particular idea of entering the office, the other sectors like the real estate, the food industry, and the traditional malls will also be staying intact, says this article. It is this that we have to understand with reference to this article. Now let's look into the next article. This article here is speaking about IITs and reservation. We did discuss about this particular issue in our last week's CNA. Now let's look into some of the preliminary practice questions. Who among the following are accorded as the particularly vulnerable tribal groups? Nicobaris, Great Andamanis, Jarawa, Sentinelese, Onge, Shompen. The answer to this is 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6. Why have we taken this practice question? Because of the reference given under this article. So kindly remember, we have 5 PVTGs. When it comes to Andaman and Nicobar, it is Great Andamanis, Onge, Jarawa, Shompen and Sentinelese. Now let's look into the next practice question. Consider the following statements with respect to Khudiram Bose. Khudiram was part of Anushilan Samiti. Khudiram, along with another revolutionary, Thakur Roshan Singh, were assigned the task of assassinating the district magistrate of Muzaffarpur, Kingsford. Which of the above statements are correct? The answer to this is one only. Why is the second statement wrong? That is because it is not Thakur Roshan Singh, but instead it is Prafulla Chaki. Why have we taken this practice question? Because of the reference given under this article. As part of the assignment, please do read about Ram Prasad Bismil, Ashfaqullah Khan as well as Thakur Roshan Singh. Now let's look into the next practice question. With reference to Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, which of the following statements is or correct? Sir Syed Ahmad Khan is known for the Aligarh movement. He promoted Western style scientific education by founding modern schools and journals. He was a loyal servant of the British administration before the revolt of 1857. Which of the statements are correct? The answer to this is 1, 2 and 3. Why have we taken this practice question? Because of the reference given under this article. Now let's look into the next practice question. Consider the following statements with respect to Zobelella denitrificans ZD1. It is a bacterium which has reported to aid in the production of bioplastics. All the bioplastics or materials that are called bioplastics are biodegradable. Which of the above statements are correct? The answer to this is one only. Why have we taken this practice question? Because of the reference given under this article. So kindly remember, this happens to be one of the bacteria which has reported to aid in the production of bioplastics. They feed on sludge, wastewater and product polyhydroxybutyrate. The researchers say that this can help reduce the burden on landfills. Now what we have to understand is that when it comes to bioplastics, they are totally different from the conventional plastics. So when we look at the common plastics, they are usually derived from the petroleum or the natural gas, but when it comes to the bioplastics, they are usually derived from the vegetable fats and oils, cornstarch, straw, wood chips, sawdust, so on and so forth. And also when it comes to bioplastics, there are two separate things. One is what is called as the bio-based plastics. The other is what is called as biodegradable plastics. When you look into the bio-based plastics, basically these are the ones where the product is manufactured from at least one of the biological matter. But when we speak about biodegradable plastics, it is that particular plastics where this can be broken down by the microbes in a reasonable amount of time frame with a specific condition. Bioplastics are usually assumed to be environmentally friendly, but that is not the same as per the current level of technology, says some of the researchers. It is this that we have to understand with reference to this article. Now let's look into the next practice question. With reference to Himalaya trillium, which of the following statements is or correct? It was declared endangered by the IUCN. It is found in India and Nepal only. The rhizome of the herb is a source of steroidal saponins and can be used as anti-cancer and anti-aging agent. Which of the statements are correct? The answer to this is 1 and 3 only. Why? Because it is not only found in India and Nepal, but it is also found in China, Bhutan, Afghanistan and Pakistan. Which of the following statements about LOFA is or correct? It is a space telescope developed in collaboration between NASA, European Space Agency and Canadian Space Agency. The project is based on interferometric array of radio telescopes using about 20,000 small antennas concentrated in at least 48 stations. Which of the statements are correct? The answer to this is 2 only. Why? Because this is not a collaboration between NASA, European Space Agency and Canadian Space Agency, but instead it is a radio telescope in the region of Netherlands and across the Europe. Why have we taken this practice question? Because of the reference given under this article. Now let's look into the next practice question. In India, why are some nuclear reactors kept under IAEA safeguards while others are not? The answer to this is some use imported uranium and others use domestic supplies. Now let's look into the mains practice question. Voting through postal ballots should be extended to the non-resident Indians. In the light of this statement, discuss its significance and operational challenges in its execution. Second question, what are the ethical challenges involved in vaccinating people with comorbidities? How do we resolve such complex issues? So please write all your answers on the comment section, peer review and also come up with constructive criticism. So this is it for today. Thank you for watching. All the best.